Hello everyone and welcome to the chapter on the Rossolimo, which arises after the moves e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. So this is one of white's main options in case we play knight c6 on move 2. White will generally be aiming to take on c6 at some point and give us double pawns. They can do so very quickly on the very next turn, or follow up with kingside castles. Now, like I said, this is one of white's main options. If we start with 96, probably the main option if we start with 96 that white has, if they don't want to play the open Sicilian. So if for whatever reason the Rossolimo does not appeal to you, but you still want to play the Accelerated Dragon, then I recommend that you check out the Hyper Accelerated Dragon chapter with G6, because here you do avoid the Rossolimo. Bishop b5 here doesn't make any sense whatsoever because the bishop's not doing anything over there. You can just go bishop g7. So this is an option, like I said, if you want to avoid the Rossolimo. But I think black is doing absolutely fine. Very often we will get the bishop pair. And in this chapter, I will teach you how to deal with the double pawns. All right, so we continue with the move g6 as we want to still play in the spirit of the accelerated dragon. We still want to follow up with bishop to g7. All right, so white has a few options here. Like I said, they can take on c6 right away or castles. They can also try to build a big center with, let's say, quick c3 and d4, and we will learn all about that in this chapter. All right, so let's say white castles. This is the second most popular move, I would say, after bishop takes c6. Here we follow up with bishop g7. I mean, usually if we go g6, bishop g7 is the next move. All right, so let's have a look. White has a few options here. If white takes on c6, for example, we will recapture with pawn takes c6, and this transposes to a line we are about to see. For example, if white plays bishop takes c6 first, b takes c6 is the move we will go for, and after castles, then bishop g7. All right, so let's say white castles, we go bishop g7. Like I said, after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, we transpose. White can also play rook to e1, and this is a bit of a waiting move, and it's a tricky one, because white is defending the pawn on e4 once more, and sometimes can push it forward, and then already that rook is lined up to defend it. And here I have two options for you. My main recommendation, I ended up deciding on e5, and the idea is to follow up with knight ge7. All right, so what white should do here, white should generally take on c6, because if they don't, then we play knight g7, and we can always recapture with the knight on c6. White can also go for a pawn sacrifice with the move b4. This is actually a move I've played myself when I was a young and upcoming player, and it's quite a tricky one. The idea is that in case black takes with the c-pawn, then white wants to go e3, and it's a bit of a reversed Banco gambit, kind of, if you will. White gets pretty good compensation after takes, especially if they can put that bishop on d6, so it really hinder black's development. So instead of that, I recommend that we take with the knight. All right, so white has a few options here. For example, white's main move is the move bishop e2, developing the bishop and attacking that pawn on e5. And here I recommend the move queen to c7, simply defending that pawn. Black is also fine after a6, but I don't quite like this line. After a3, takes here, takes. White will likely get their pawn back. Black is doing very fine because we have the bishop pair, but I feel like it's going to be harder to fight here for the win than the line I'm about to recommend. All right, so like I said, the move I recommend is the move queen c7, simply defending that pawn on e5. White usually follows up with c3. White can also play, we take with the knight, so bishop b2, queen c7. White can also play d4, another gambit, striking the center right away, but black goes a6 and is doing fine here. White generally does not get enough compensation here for the pawn they sacrificed. All right, so let's say white goes c3, attacking our knight. We will move our knight back to the c6 square because it's the only good square for our knight. And now white goes d4. So this is white's idea. They sacrifice the pawn, but they quickly want to blast open the center before we're able to finish our development. So it's really good to know how to deal with all of this. But here we want to keep the center closed. So we play the move d6 to defend both the e5 and c5 pawns. Now white's main move is the move d5, because knight on c6 is pinned and white wants to put pressure on it. But fortunately, we have the move a6, because of course we want to break the pin. All right, so White has a few options here. Their main move is knight a3. Let's say white goes bishop a4 to try to maintain the pin. Here, once again, we have to break the pin with the move b5, and black is better here because white's down a pawn and they don't quite have enough compensation. Also, the position is fairly close, so it will always be really hard for white to prove the compensation for the pawn they sacrificed. All right, so this is what we do in case white goes bishop a4. White can also go queen a4 if they want to maintain the pin on the knight. And now they're also pinning our a-pawn. We cannot take as that leaves our rook on a8 hanging. But fortunately, we have the clever rook to b8. Now we're getting ready to take the bishop. And black is much better here. Again, white does not have enough compensation for the pawn they sacrificed. The position is fairly closed. And black has a big advantage here. I mean, after the bishop moves, we can always follow up with b5 to break the pin. So black's much better. All right, so that's what we do here. White's main move is knight a3, and this is a tricky one because the idea is in case we take, now white wants to play knight takes b5, hitting our queen, also eyeing our pawn on d6, also aiming to take here, and then take on d6. So white gets the advantage. We don't want to get into this. Instead, what we do is we can get out of the pin in a very elegant way with the move king to e7. We get out of the pin, and now the idea is in case white takes, we take the bishop. White takes now. Now we can take on c6. Black is up a pawn. We defend the pawn on d6. And white does not get enough compensation here. I'll definitely pick black here. Black is up a pawn. We have the bishop pair. And so we have excellent chances to fight for the win. White, of course, does not have to take on c6. They can also move the bishop. But I quite like black's chances here because the center is closed. We're up a pawn. And because the center is closed, it will be very difficult for white to ever prove the compensation. So we have a nice imbalance and plenty of chances here to fight for the win. You just have to make sure that the center doesn't open up because then white's leading development could count for something. But if the center stays closed, black is doing very well. All right, so b4, it's a good gambit to know, but if we know it, then black is doing excellent. White's main move after the move e5 is to take on c6. And here we should recapture with the d-pawn because now our bishop is ready to move. We don't really want to take with the b-pawn here, and you'll learn that shortly in the line starting with bishop takes c6 and move 4. Generally what white does here against our center with the pawns on e5 and c5 is white follows up with a quick c3 followed by d4. And white is generally considered to be better here, so I want to avoid these types of positions. All right, so instead we take with the d-pawn. And black is doing quite fine here. I mean, yes, we have the double pawns, but we also have the bishop pair. Let's say white goes d3, by far their most popular move. We will play queen to e7. And the idea is that we want to develop our knight to the f6 square generally, because now the pawn on e5 is defended, the pawn on c5 is defended as well. And we have a very interesting imbalance. Generally, what we're going to do is we're going to follow up with kingside castles, and we want to try to get our knight to the e6 square. So either via d7, f8 and e6 after we play a move like rook fd8, or another idea is to maneuver the knight via e8, c7, and then to e6 with a fine game for black. All right, so that is what we do here. Black is doing fine here. Like I said, we have a nice imbalance. We have the double pawns, but we also have the bishop pair, so plenty of chances to fight for the win. All right, so instead of that, you can also play there is also the move knight f6, which I also offer as an alternative. Black is also doing fine here because if white goes e5, we go knight e5. And let's say white goes knight c3, then we go knight c7, hitting the bishop on b5. And in case white takes on c6, here we do take with the d-pawn. Once again, you don't want to take with the b-pawn because then white follows up with a quick d4. And after takes, white gets a big advantage. The queen comes out, it can often swing over to h4, followed by bishop h6. And it's not so easy for black to entangle here. I mean, yes, we have the bishop pair, but our pieces are not so active. So white is having a very nice position here. So instead, what we do is we take with the d-pawn to open up our light square bishop. White's main move is to go knight e4, hitting the pawn on c5 and threatening to go knight f6. But we simply play b6, defending the pawn on c5. Because we still want to be able to move out our light square bishop. Knight e6 is an option as well. Now knight f6 is not an option, but we're blocking in our light square bishop, and we really want to move out that piece to the g4 square, for example, where it would put pressure on the knight, and then the pawn on e5 becomes a bit vulnerable. All right. So we go b6. White's main move is the move knight f6 check. Then we go king f8, moving our king over, and white moves back. So white has lost 2 tempi, but we have lost the right to castle. I mean, our king, we cannot castle, and that also means the rook on h8 can often be a little bit stuck. But black is generally doing fine here after the move bishop g4. We're putting pressure on the knight on f3. The pawn on e5 can become a bit weak as well. And the idea is that in case white goes d3, we're going to follow up with knight e6 with a fine game for black. I mean, again, we have a nice imbalance here. Yes, we have the double pawns, but we also have the bishop pair. The pawn e5 can be a little bit weak, so black is doing absolutely fine. All right, so knight f6 also an alternative, especially if you don't want to put your own pawn on e5. If you're like, hey, it feels a bit counterintuitive to put the pawn on e5, then knight f6 is an option as well. All right, and it's important to note that in case white takes on c6, here once again, we should recapture with the d pawn to bring our bishop to life. Once again, I don't quite like the positions after b takes c6, because white's going to follow up with a quick e5 attacking our knight, and let's say knight e5. Then white goes c4, knight c7, followed by a quick d4. So either d4 here, or knight c3 followed by d4. And white has good chances for an advantage. So as you might start to learn by now, we want to avoid these types of positions where we have these, where we took with the b pawn, white's going to follow up with a quick d4, bring that queen out. Once again, that queen is often going to swing over to h4, bishop h6, and white gets a really unpleasant initiative. So that's why we should take with the d pawn. And here, once again, we will generally be aiming to get our knight to the e6 square. So let's say we're going to follow with kingside castles, and a plan could be knight e8 to c7 to e6, right? All right. So this is an alternative as well. White can also aim to build a big center with the move c3, followed by d4. And here we go, knight f6, hitting the pawn on e4. All right, so white generally defends it with rook e1. White can also go e5, attacking our knight, but now we go knight d5. And we see here white's lost a bit of a tempo with the move c3. Also now, if they ever take on c6 after, let's say, d takes, black is always doing completely fine because white has weakened the light squares with this move c3. So this is absolutely nothing to worry about. White will often follow up with d4, aiming to build a big center, but it's kind of like an L pin, right? But this move bishop e5 is not the most useful. You know, white would usually like to play bishop c4 quickly if the bishop was still in f1 to develop quickly and try to build up an initiative and potentially an attack. But here, after d4, what we play is we go knight to c7. So we delay the trade on d4, because if we take right away, white can easily bring out the knight to the c3 square, and black is doing quite fine here. It's important to note that after knight c7, we are not losing a pawn, because if white takes on c6, we can recapture with the d pawn, and let's say they take on c5, we will very quickly get the pawn back, as we can take on d1, and at the right recaptures, bishop g4. I mean, e5 is a bit weak, c5 is vulnerable, and black will get the pawn back with a good position. All right, so this is what we do in case white goes e5. Absolutely nothing to worry about. The pawns can become a bit vulnerable. Instead, white's main move is the move rook to e1, and white still wants to follow up with a quick d4 push. It's, by the way, important to know that you can reach this position through 2 ways. One of them is this way, if white goes for c3 followed by rook e1. White can also go rook e1 here, and then after knight f6, then after knight f6, now c3. This is another way to reach that position. All right, so let's say white goes c3, we go knight f6, developing our knight, attacking the pawn e4, and let's say white goes rook e1. Now we go castles, and here white has a few options. For example, white can go h3 with the idea to go d4, still to go d4, and now they never have to worry about our bishop potentially coming out to the g4 square after, let's say, we play d5. But it's a bit slow. Now we make it difficult for white to get d4 in with the move e5, putting our pawn in the middle. And there's an important point that, let's say white goes d4, it's here very important to take with the c pawn. You don't want to take with the e pawn because then white goes for the immediate e5 with a nice initiative in the center. Instead, what we do is we play c takes d4. And after white recaptures with their pawn, now we have a nice little tactic. We can go knight takes d4, hitting the bishop on b5, so white should absolutely take with their knight. And now we have a nice move with queen to b6. So we're hitting the knight on d4 once more, and if the knight moves, we take the bishop on b5. And black very well could win a pawn here. White could get some compensation, but we get the interesting imbalance that we want, right? I mean, hey, an extra pawn always will give us plenty of chance to fight for the win, and it will be up to white to prove the compensation. If they don't prove it, then our extra pawn can definitely mean a lot in the endgame. So this is what we do here. We're going to win a pawn, and it will be up to white to prove the compensation. All right, so this is what we do in case of h3. It's important to note, by the way, that e5 does not lose a pawn, because in case white takes on c6, we can now recapture with the d pawn. With the move c3, white's also weakened the light squares a little bit, so black is doing absolutely fine here. And let's say white takes on e5, now we go rook e8. So we hit the knight, and we're also eyeing the pawn on e4. And white's not in good shape to hang on to the pawn, because let's say they go d4, we can take on d4, and if white recaptures, we now have a nice tactical idea with knight takes e4. The idea being that if white takes with the rook, we can now take on e5 as well. And black is doing very fine here. I mean, we have the bishop pair, a slightly better pawn structure, so black has excellent chances here to fight for the win. So that's what we're doing in case of h3. We go e5. A mistake I see a lot of people make is that they go for d5 prematurely, but this is really not a good move, because white goes e5, and now often you would like to play knight e4, but this is not an option, as white goes d3, and the knight is getting trapped. So you're going to have to move back to a more passive square, like e8 or d7, but then white holds a lot of trumps. White has a nice center, the bishop on g7 is passive, and the bishop on c8 as well. So white is doing very fine here. So once again, instead of that, we play e5 with a fine game. White can also play d4 right away, building the center, but now we have a nice move with the move a6 as we attack the bishop on b5. And white has a few options here. Note that this move does not lose a pawn, because we'll go over that shortly. White can play bishop d3, for example, dropping the bishop back. But now we go for d5, and if white goes e5, we go knight e4. A pretty typical sequence in these lines. If white goes for d4, d5 and knight e4 is often a pretty typical response. And black has a very good game here. It's important that we push that bishop away from b5 so white can never take on c6 anymore, which would alleviate our pressure on the d4 pawn. We're going to follow with bishop f5 or bishop g4. Generally, we're going to take on d4 and queen b6 as well to put even more pressure on the d4 pawn. And black is doing very fine here. All right, so this is really all you have to know in case white goes for a very quick c3 followed by d4. Although that being said, white's main move is bishop takes c6. Of course, we should go over this one. Here we recapture with the d pawn, because now our bishop is ready to move out to a square like g4, where it would put pressure on the knight, and so we would put pressure on d4. This move once again is not losing material, because in case white takes on c5, we can now take on d1 and take on e4. And black is much better here because we have the bishop pair, white has the double pawns, so big advantage for black. All right, so instead of that, what they can also do is they can also go e5, pushing their pawn forward and now aiming to take on c5. But here we go knight d7, defending the pawn on c5. We're getting ready to take on d4, and black is doing quite fine here. I mean, once again, we have the imbalance that we want. We have the bishop pair, so black has excellent chances here to fight for the win. All right, so instead of e5, white can also go h3. This is by far and large their main move. Now we will take on d4 and doubling our pawns. White will recapture with their pawn. Yes, they're getting the c3 square for the knight, but at some point we want to get rid of our double pawns and take. And here we put more pressure on white center with the move c5. So we hit the pawn on d4. Once again, we're not hanging a pawn because in case white would, let's say, take, once again, we can trade the queens, take the e4 pawn with an excellent position for black. We have the bishop pair, the c5 pawn is hanging, and black is doing really well. White can also play e5, hitting our knight, once again aiming to take on c5, but we will respond with the typical knight d7. We defend the pawn on c5, and black is already doing pretty well here. We have the bishop pair, plenty of ways to put pressure on white center. For example, b5 followed by bishop b7 is a really good way to do so, and I would already pick black here. All right, so this is what we do in case of e5. White's best move by far is the move d5, keeping their center intact. And here what we do is we play b5. So we grab more space on the queen side, aiming to go bishop b7 next, bring the bishop to life. often, you might want to play e6 at the right moment, putting pressure on the pawn on d5, maybe e6, quite quickly, or prepared with rook e8 and then e6, so that in case white takes, you can always recapture with the rook. And once again, we have a nice imbalance. White has more pawns in the middle, but we have a bishop pair, which will give us plenty of chance to fight for the win. All right, so that is what we do if white castles, followed by c3 and d4. Instead of castles, white can also play c3, aiming to follow with a quick d4. But here what we do is we play knight f6. In pretty typical Alpin fashion, very often when you see c3, you want to go knight e4, and knight f6, hit the pawn on e4. And here white does not have a very convenient way to defend it because they have not castled yet, so they don't have the move rook e1 available to defend that pawn. So in case white goes e5, now we go knight e5, and this move bishop e5 is not ideal. Often if we go for, knight e5 lines, white would like to play bishop to c4 in one go, but here they've already moved out the bishop to b5, so black is doing pretty fine. We're going to follow up with moves like bishop g7, bishop g7, knight c7, d6, kingside castles, and we will have plenty of ways to put pressure on white center with a good game for black. So this is what you have to know if white goes for an early c3 push. Instead of that, white's main move is bishop takes c6, giving us the double pawns. That's really one of the main ideas in the Rossolimo, and here we will play b takes c6. So you will also learn this in the chapters on the open Sicilian. In case white goes, let's say, d4, followed by knight takes d4, and then knight takes c6, you almost always want to recapture with that b pawn. You want to recapture towards the center, because it gives us a half-open b file that will be quite useful for the rook. And I quite like the idea of having more pawns in the middle. All right, so white has a few moves here. Let's say white goes d4, putting pressure on the center right away. Here, taking d4 is a little tricky as white's going to recapture with the queen, hitting the rook on h8 right away. So I don't quite recommend this. An easier way to deal with the move d4 is simply bishop g7. Now we're getting ready to take on d4, because let's say white castles, we can take, and white would be forced to recapture with the knight. And black is doing pretty well here already because we have more pawns in the middle and we have the bishop pair. So I would already pick black here. White's main move after bishop g7 is to take on c5, to at least create some problems for us, but we can easily get the pawn back with queen a5 check. So we check the king and we hit the pawn on c5. Let's say white goes knight bd2, their main move. Now we take the pawn, and black is doing pretty fine. We have more pawns in the middle, we have the bishop pair, and we're going to follow up with d6, knight f6, kingside castles, with a very fine game for black. All right, so that's really all you have to know in case white goes for an early d4. White can also go kingside castles, and now we go bishop g7. And these positions are pretty interesting. So we see here we have the bishop pair, we have more pawns in the middle, but we also have the double pawns. And it's really important to know how to deal with double pawns. Generally, black is pretty happy to get the move e5 in. You might be wondering, like, why? Why do we want to go e5? Like, why do we want to block our own bishop? Well, if we don't go e5, white might play e5 themselves. And then after e5, the pawns on c5 can be a little bit disconnected. So let's have a look. Let's say white goes knight c3, a pretty popular move, but this is actually a mistake. Now we're going to play e5. We grab more space in the middle. And at first, this might be a bit counterintuitive to you. You might think like, well, why are we blocking our bishop? But we're going to follow with d6, possibly knight e7, kingside castles, f5. And if we get all of those moves in, black can get a really nice initiative going on the king side. And white here doesn't have a good way to put pressure on our center. So white should avoid putting a knight on c3, because often they want to build a big center with c3 and d4, or at least blow up our center. So white's main move by far is the move rook e1. And like I said, this is a tricky position because we want to get the pawn on e5, but if we go e5 right here, white's going to go c3, followed by d4, and blow up our center. So we don't want this. We also don't want to play d6, because here white's going to go e5. And now white's idea is simply to take here and give us double isolated pawns on the queen side, or on the c file. Let's say we go knight h6, white takes, we would have to recapture with the queen, and these pawns are terribly weak. So we want to avoid this. Also, we don't want to play d5. You might think like, well, now I don't have double isolated pawns. Well, this pawn on c5 is terribly weak, and white can easily attack it, and it will be very difficult for us to defend it. White can go, let's say, b3, d3, bishop a3, knight c3, knight a4. Plenty of ways to attack it, and very difficult for us to defend it. So this pawn might very easily drop. So this is a very tricky pawn structure. Also, as you might know by now, we don't want to go for a move like knight f6, as here white goes e5, pushing the pawn, knight e5, and then the typical stuff with c4, knight c7, and here either d4 right away, or knight c3 followed by d4. So this is a very tricky line. What we do is we play queen c7, a clever waiting move. And really the point behind this move is that we want to follow up with d6, as now in case white goes e5, we can simply take, as we have that queen on c7, covering the e5 square once more. So this is a clever waiting move, and let's have a look at some of white's options. Let's say white goes h3. White is making a waiting move as well. Well, then we play d6. So we, continue to improve our position a little bit. And once again, white can go e5, but we will take. And yes, we have doubled isolated pawns here. We have doubled pawns in e file, but we have an extra pawn, and it's an extra central pawn. So black is doing very fine here. Again, we have the nice imbalance that we want. Plenty of chance for black to fight for the win with a good game. So this is what we're doing in case of h3. We go d6, and we kind of wait and see what white is going to do. Let's say white goes d3, another waiting move. Now here we should go e5. So we grab more space in the center. And what white usually does in case we go e5 is they want to try to blow up our center with c3 followed by d4. But here, since they've already played d2, d3, they're losing a bit of a tempo. And we have the useful move queen c7. And because of queen c7, we can now play knight f6. So we're getting ready for kingside castles. We have to give up on ideas of f7, f5, but also because white is going to go d4, so that is really out of the question. And our knight on f6 is well placed to deal with the tension in the center. So let's say white goes d4, sticking through with their plan. We're going to take. Almost always you want to take with the c pawn first, and this is no exception. Just get rid of those double pawns first. Let's say white takes, and now we take with the e pawn. And let's say white recaptures with their queen. White's aiming to follow up with knight c3, and now we go kingside castles with a fine game for black. I mean, white has an active queen in the middle, but we have the bishop pair. So pretty fine game here for black, and we will also have our chances to fight for the win. Once again, because we have the bishop pair. All right. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is what we do in case of white goes d3. White can also play e5 if they want to make it difficult for us. Now, again, we don't really want to go d6 as white's going to take, and we're stuck with these double isolated pawns. We don't want this at all. Also, we can no longer put a pawn on e5 ourselves, but we do want to get rid of that e5 pawn as quickly as possible. And so we should do so with the move f6, hitting that pawn on e5. Now, white has a few options here. For example, white can go e6, sacrificing a pawn, but we simply take it. And black has a pretty fine game here. Yes, once again, these pawns are doubled and isolated, but we have an extra pawn. And play here can continue with something like knight c3, e5. Here also, you're often just going to have to accept that you lose that c5 pawn. But, we have a nice center, we have a bishop pair, so black is doing pretty fine. Because let's say white goes d3, we go knight h6, the best way to develop our knight, and let's say white goes bishop e3, we now castle. Let's say white takes the pawn, we now go f5 with knight f7 coming next. And black has excellent chances here to fight for the win. We have nice pawns in the middle, we have the bishop pair, so pretty good chances to fight. All right, instead of e6, the pawn sacrifice, white can also take on f6, but we simply recapture with the knight. And black is doing pretty fine. We now keep a nice pawn structure because all of our pawns are still connected. We can still follow up with d6, kingside castles, with a very fine game for black. We have more pawns in the middle, we have the bishop pair, and so that is really what we want. All right. White also has a tricky move with the move d4, continuing to develop quickly. So here we should take the pawn on d4, and white has a tricky move here with bishop f4, going for a gambit, threatening e takes f6, which would hit our queen, and the bishop on g7. So we have to know what we're doing here. Here what we do is we go pawn takes e5. And white has a few options here. For example, white can take with the knight, now threatening knight takes g6, which would hit our rook in the corner and our queen on c7. So we should play d6, kicking that knight away. Now I can go knight c4, threatening our d6 pawn with both the knight and the bishop. But fortunately, we can solve all of our problems with the move king to f7. We step out of the pin on the e-file. King f7, a very important move to remember, as it's the only good move for black. But black is doing pretty fine here. I mean, we're up a pawn. We have a lot of pawns in the middle. We have the bishop pair. So it really has to know, white really has to know what they're doing here. Because if they don't, they're just down a pawn and they might not get enough compensation. The king might look a little bit airy, but keep in mind that we can always castle by hand, so to speak. If we go knight f6, rook f8, and then king to g8. All right, so this is what we do in case white goes knight takes c5. White can also go bishop takes c5, hitting our queen and our bishop, so we absolutely have to take. White should recapture with the knight, and now we go d6. And black is a very fine game here. We're going to follow with knight f6 and kingside castles. We're often simply going to return that pawn on d4, but black has a pretty good chance to fight for the win. We have more pawns in the middle and a bishop, so that gives us a nice imbalance to create some chances. So black is doing pretty fine here. Instead of all of this, the main move probably for white is the move c3, aiming to follow up with d4. But now we go d6. Once again, we want to keep waiting a little bit with our moves. Once again, if white goes e5, we will simply take that pawn and ask white, like, hey, where's your compensation? So white's main move is d4, building the big center. Now we will simply get rid of our double pawns, and we go knight f6. And black is doing absolutely fine here. We're going to follow with kingside castles. Yes, white has two pawns in the middle, but we have the bishop pair, and we have plenty of good chances, plenty of good ways to put pressure on white's center. For example, after kingside castles, we can follow with a quick c5 with or without bishop b7. That's another way that we can activate our other bishop. And so black has a pretty good game here. Like I said, with the bishop pair, more pawns in the middle, and that's really the imbalance that we want. So best of luck against the Rossolimo. I'm sure you're going to do great against it. Once again, if all of this does not appeal to you, you can also avoid the Rossolimo by going g6 on move number 2. But again, I think the Rossolimo is no problem whatsoever, as all of these lines will have you covered. So best of luck.